Today, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett takes on Texas top leaders, exposing hidden failures and calling them out by name. What happens next will leave everyone stunned and completely change the conversation. Jasmine Crockett's Senate announcement in Dallas wasn't the usual polished, rehearsed campaign speech. From the moment she walked onto the stage, the air shifted. A quiet intensity settled over the crowd. This wasn't going to be a routine address. It was going to be a reckoning. Crockett began not by talking about her platform or ambitions, but by spotlighting issues that had long been ignored: rural hospital closures, surging gun violence, skyrocketing costs, and voter suppression under the Abbott administration. And at the center of it, she named the person she believed had failed Texas: Senator John Cornyn. She didn't deliver a fiery monologue for the cameras. Instead, she methodically laid out the facts, citing specific counties where hospitals had shut down, leaving communities without emergency care. Families were forced to drive for hours during critical medical situations, and Crockett painted a vivid picture of the human toll: lives delayed, dreams disrupted, and public safety compromised. The audience didn't react with applause or chants. They reacted with recognition. This was real. This was personal. And Cornyn, she emphasized, had remained silent. Gun violence, she continued, wasn't a statistic. It was a story of lives interrupted. Crockett referenced recent tragedies that the nation couldn't ignore, framing them not as political talking points, but as moral imperatives. If leadership doesn't speak when lives are at stake, she told the crowd, when will it speak at all? The words carried weight because they weren't vague accusations. They were calls for accountability tied directly to Cornyn's record, or lack thereof then. Turning to economic issues, Crockett highlighted the crushing impact of tariffs, rising costs, and shrinking resources for working families. She didn't just present numbers, she connected them to everyday Texans, the single parents struggling to pay rent, while grocery bills climb, the farmer facing higher supply costs because of trade restrictions, and the small business owner wondering if their town could survive without a local hospital or pharmacy. Every statistic had a human face, and Crockett made sure the audience saw it. Amid this, voter suppression under the Abbott administration was not left unchallenged. Crockett described communities whose voices had been diluted by redistricting, mailers that confused and misled voters, and bureaucratic barriers that disenfranchised the most vulnerable. She didn't rely on hyperbole. She relied on documented evidence and pointed directly to the silence of those in power. Cornyn, she implied, wasn't just failing in oversight. He was failing to protect democracy itself. Crockett's delivery was calm, precise, and deliberate. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, just sharp clarity. And that clarity made the confrontation even more piercing. Each issue she raised was backed by evidence, and each critique was targeted, leaving little room for deflection. The strategy was clear. Texas deserves leaders who acknowledge problems and act, not those who hide behind political convenience. The crowd's reaction was telling. Murmurs spread as cameras captured nods of agreement, hands raised in silent support, and the occasional audible gasp at the precision of her critique. It wasn't chaos or spectacle, it was acknowledgement. This wasn't a staged political moment. It was a real, consequential exposure of systemic neglect, and Crockett ensured that Cornyn's inaction was front and center by the end of her address. The room wasn't just attentive. It was compelled. Clips from the speech quickly circulated online, highlighting her direct challenge to Cornyn. Social media erupted as users dissected each statement, debated each statistic, and shared segments of the speech that underscored Crockett's accountability-focused approach. The narrative was shifting in real time. Crockett wasn't just announcing a campaign. She was defining the political conversation in Texas, Cornyn's team. Insiders later noted began to quietly strategize behind the scenes, aware that this public reckoning had not only captured attention, but set a benchmark for scrutiny moving forward. Crockett's Dallas speech demonstrated that political theater isn't about volume or flash, it's about precision, evidence, and moral clarity. By naming Cornyn and connecting systemic failures to human impact, she created a moment that resonated with voters long before campaign ads, debates, or press releases. In one sweep, she reframed the conversation, turning a standard announcement into a defining political moment that the state would nod as. The crowd settled after Jasmine Crockett's opening remarks. The energy in the Dallas hall was electric, but the tension was palpable. Crockett's voice cut through the hum of anticipation, unwavering and deliberate, as she pivoted seamlessly from general policy concerns to the specific failures of Senator John Cornyn. What had begun as a broad critique of Texas politics now honed in on Cornyn's record, exposing cracks that had long been glossed over. She didn't rush. Each word carried weight, each sentence meticulously crafted to land with clarity and precision. She began by highlighting the human cost of rural hospital closures, subject that often gets buried under partisan talking points. Crockett recounted stories from constituents: mothers traveling hours for prenatal care, seniors waiting days for critical treatment, and families forced to choose between food and prescriptions. These weren't abstract statistics. They were vivid, lived realities. The audience leaned in, murmurs of recognition spreading through the room. By putting faces and experiences at the forefront, she framed Cornyn's silence not just as political negligence, but as a moral failing that had tangible consequences. Shifting gears, Crockett dissected gun violence in Texas, weaving together local data and national trends. She contrasted cities with proactive safety initiatives against rural areas left vulnerable due to lack of funding and legislative inertia. Cornyn's record, she argued, reflected a pattern of prioritizing political expediency over constituent safety. Her delivery was sharp but measured, never veering into hyperbole, allowing facts to dominate the narrative, while her controlled intensity underscored the seriousness of the subject. For viewers following online, the meticulous detailing felt almost cinematic, a visual of Texas neighborhoods paired with her pointed commentary, punctuated by the weight of lived experience. The crowd responded in real time. A wave of murmurs, nods, and intermittent applause mirrored the resonance of her words. Crockett didn't pause. She capitalized on the momentum, pivoting to rising costs and the economic burden on working families. She unpacked Trump-era tariffs and Cornyn's complicitous lack of opposition, highlighting the ripple effects on small businesses, farmers, and everyday Texans. By connecting national policies directly to local struggles, Crockett reinforced her thesis. Cornyn's tenure had often shielded political allies while leaving ordinary citizens exposed. The narrative was no longer abstract. It was a direct confrontation that linked policy decisions to human consequences. Perhaps most striking was her treatment of voter suppression under Governor Abbott's administration. Crockett framed it as a continuation of systemic disenfranchisement that had persisted for decades. Her approach was methodical, citing court rulings, statistical disparities, and specific legislative maneuvers. Every point was backed by credible evidence, giving her critique a backbone that was impossible to dismiss. She called out Cornyn by name, holding him accountable for his complicity through inaction. The delivery was surgical, concise yet forceful, leaving no room for obfuscation or diversion. The audience reacted visibly. Applause, gasps, and raised eyebrows marked the gravity of the moment for anyone observing. It was a textbook example of political accountability executed live. Amidst the intensity, Crockett interwove a sense of strategy and optimism. She wasn't merely condemning. She was signaling a roadmap for civic engagement and empowerment. Grassroots organizations, voter registration initiatives, and community advocacy became integral threads of her narrative. By framing challenges alongside actionable solutions, she avoided descending into mere criticism, instead positioning herself as a proactive leader ready to mobilize Texan voters. The energy in the room shifted subtly from shock and awareness to motivation and resolve. It was clear that Crockett's intent was not just to critique Cornyn, but to galvanize an entire electorate to take note, get involved, and influence the political landscape. As the segment progressed, Crockett's cadence and tone evolved, mirroring the trajectory of her argument. Early moments were informative, laying the groundwork with context and data. Midway, she escalated tension, driving home Cornyn's lapses and policy blind spots. Towards the end, she infused urgency and vision, highlighting how Texans could collectively respond to systemic failures. The interplay between exposition and emotional appeal was masterful. Viewers online and in person alike felt the narrative arc as a journey rather than a static speech. Each pivot was deliberate, every pause calculated to let points resonate fully before advancing to the next critical topic. By the time Crockett concluded this phase of her address, it was evident that she had successfully reframed the conversation. Cornyn's historical record, often glossed over in mainstream coverage, was now under intense public scrutiny. The meticulous alignment of stories, evidence, and human impact elevated her critique beyond partisan talking points. For supporters and critics alike, the moment was unforgettable, a convergence of political acumen, moral clarity, and strategic communication that left the audience considering not only the failure she exposed, but the potential for corrective action in the future. Throughout, her presence maintained a sense of unshakable authority. She balanced empathy and critique, passion and composure, allowing the substance of her argument to shine while her delivery commanded attention. From rural healthcare crises to economic burdens and voter suppression, every point reinforced the narrative. Leadership is measured not by rhetoric, but by tangible impact on people's lives. Crockett's address was more than a political statement. It was a demonstration of accountability, a challenge to complacency, and a blueprint for civic engagement in Texas and beyond. The momentum from Jasmine Crockett's fiery Dallas's announcement didn't just fade after the initial media clips went viral. It intensified, forcing political operatives and journalists alike to reassess what Texas' political landscape might look like in the coming months. As she stood at the podium, her voice unwavering and her delivery precise, Crockett didn't merely criticize. She meticulously laid out the interconnected crises that had long been ignored or sidestepped by the state's leadership. Cornyn's silence, once a political shield, was systematically dismantled under the spotlight of her facts, anecdotes, and data-driven arguments. Crockett's ability to weave multiple crises into a coherent narrative created a narrative that was almost impossible to counter without addressing each specific claim. Rural hospital closures, she noted, weren't just statistics. They were stories of communities losing access to life-saving care, elderly residents forced to drive hours for routine treatments, and small towns grappling with the consequences of policy neglect. She cited specific counties in West Texas where closures had left populations vulnerable, tying these local impacts back to the broader state-level decisions that had enabled them. By doing so, Crockett reframed the issue from an abstract policy debate into a human-centered, crisis-demanding immediate attention. Gun violence in Texas was another pillar of her argument. Rather than using generic talking points, she presented recent figures that showcased the rise in incidents across urban and rural areas alike. What made her delivery striking was the juxtaposition she created between statistical evidence and the human cost families affected. Schools forced into lockdown drills and law enforcement stretched beyond capacity. In one carefully timed sentence, she highlighted how these trends intersected with the state's legislative priorities. suggesting that leadership choices, not mere chance, were responsible for escalating risks. Cornyn's office had long touted crime prevention initiatives. Yet Crockett's precision made those claims appear hollow by exposing the gaps between rhetoric and reality. The economic angle further strengthened her position. Rising costs from healthcare premiums to property taxes were presented not as abstract economic indicators, but as tangible burdens on everyday Texans. Crockett broke down policy decisions, tax shifts, and federal impacts under Trump's tariffs, framing them as decisions with immediate consequences for constituents' wallets. This approach resonated deeply with local media, which picked up her detailed comparisons between average household expenses and legislative inaction. Her ability to simplify complex economic interplays without losing nuance elevated her beyond a typical political speaker. She was now a credible analyst, a storyteller, and a challenger to entrenched power all at once. Then there was voter suppression. Crockett's remarks were precise and unapologetic. She directly addressed how policies and administrative choices under Abbott's governance had created barriers for minority and marginalized communities, particularly in urban centers where Democratic voter bases reside. What made her argument especially compelling was her integration of historical context with present-day examples. She traced patterns from past redistricting efforts, highlighting how the new maps potentially diluted voter influence. Her articulation wasn't just accusatory, it was educational, enlightening viewers on mechanisms that are often buried in legalese, yet have profound implications on representation. Throughout this unfolding narrative, the energy in the room was palpable. Crockett's cadence and timing emphasized each point, drawing attention to both the data and its consequences. Observers noted that Cornyn's aides began to shift uncomfortably, unable to craft a counter-narrative in real time, without contradicting prior statements or acknowledging previously overlooked failures. The lack of immediate response became a visual cue for viewers. The arguments presented were robust, researched, and difficult to dispute on the spot. Crockett's mastery of timing when to pause, when to emphasize, when to pivot, transformed the speech. From a routine political event into a tactical dismantling of opponent credibility as the speech circulated online. Reactions were swift and wide-ranging. Political analysts dissected her approach, praising how she combined storytelling with statistical precision. Social media users highlighted particular phrases, sharing clips that underscored her ability to connect with audiences across demographic lines. Traditional media coverage began framing the narrative not just around what Crockett said, but what her approach signified, a new wave of political engagement that fused grassroots accountability with high-level policy critique. In many ways, she was no longer speaking only to the Dallas audience. Her words were echoing across Texas and beyond, challenging both media narratives and political assumptions. One of the most striking aspects of Crockett's approach was how she maintained a balance between confrontation and solution-oriented framing. While she highlighted failures and gaps in leadership, she also presented actionable points, suggesting pathways for reform and community engagement. This wasn't mere political theater. It was strategic communication designed to mobilize support while demonstrating governance readiness. The juxtaposition of critique with constructive insight reinforced her credibility, signaling that her challenge to Cornyn wasn't partisan rhetoric, but a call for measurable accountability. By the end of the address, the ripple effects were undeniable. Cornyn's silence remained, not out of composure, but as a strategic retreat in the face of relentless, fact-based scrutiny. Crockett's speech had not only amplified constituent concerns, it had forced a broader conversation about political responsibility, leadership efficacy, and voter empowerment in Texas. Analysts noted that even the most seasoned operatives would now need to account for her presence in every strecky calculation for upcoming elections. In sum, Jasmine Crockett's Dallas appearance wasn't just a campaign launch, it was a masterclass in modern political strategy. by blending detailed evidence, human-centered storytelling, and unflinching accountability. She exposed leadership gaps, energized voters, and reframed Texas politics in real time. The impact of this moment would be measured not just in headlines, but in how political actors, media organizations, and citizens themselves responded to a demonstration of precision, clarity, and fearless confrontation, as the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's Dallas speech reverberated through political circles. Her momentum didn't slow, it accelerated. What had begun as a local campaign announcement had evolved into a case study on how precise messaging, strategic timing, and factual rigor can reshape narratives in real time. The moment Crockett called out Senator John Cornyn's silence on the state's pressing crises was only the beginning. What followed would underscore her mastery of political theater married with substantive critique. By mid-afternoon, clips from her speech were trending nationwide, shared across social media platforms by constituents, journalists, and political commentators alike. Each highlighted segment, whether addressing rural hospital closures or the mechanics of voter suppression, was dissected for both content and delivery. Analysts noted that Crockett's ability to tie granular policy failures to broad systemic issues gave her remarks a layered depth. She wasn't simply criticizing. She was educating, exposing, and challenging simultaneously. Her message that Texans deserved accountability resonated in ways few contemporary politicians achieve. The healthcare segment drew particularly sharp attention. By citing concrete examples of hospitals closing in small towns, complete with local statistics and patient anecdotes, Crockett transformed abstract policy discussions into tangible, human crises. Viewers saw families struggling with long commutes for essential care, and social media reactions reflected immediate empathy and outrage. News outlets began framing her commentary not as partisan talking points, but as a spotlight on leadership failures that had tangible consequences. Crockett's emphasis on real-world impact over political rhetoric created a compelling contrast with the historically cautious posture of Cornyn's office, highlighting her willingness to confront systemic neglect head-on. Gun violence, another pillar of her speech, was addressed with equal rigor. Rather than relying on generalized fear-mongering, Crockett broke down recent upticks in incidents across urban and rural Texas, emphasizing patterns and underlying causes. The precision of her analysis, tying legislative inaction to community risk, forced political commentators to acknowledge a glaring reality: policy choices have immediate consequences. Her delivery, marked by carefully timed pauses and strategic emphasis, underscored the human cost, driving home a point that statistics alone often fail to convey. Economic grievances were also central. Crockett illuminated rising costs, including healthcare premiums, property taxes, and the localized impacts of Trump-era tariffs. By framing these issues through the lens of average Texan households, she made complex fiscal policy relatable. The clarity and accessibility of her explanation made it difficult for detractors to minimize or deflect from the points she raised. In this way, Crockett positioned herself not only as a critic, but as a communicator capable of translating technical policy implications into everyday relevance. Voter suppression, often an opaque and legally convoluted topic, was presented in a similarly digestible manner. Crockett meticulously traced redistricting patterns, highlighting where minority and marginalized voters might be disadvantaged. Rather than merely pointing fingers, she connected these structural issues to broader questions of democratic integrity, emphasizing the stakes for upcoming elections. By embedding historical context alongside current implications, she made the case that leadership decisions and the silence of elected officials, like Cornyn, directly affected voter power and representation. Throughout the event, Crockett's command over tone and pacing was evident. She maintained an authoritative presence without veering into aggression, ensuring that her critique remained both powerful and credible. Every anecdote, statistic, and policy analysis was seamlessly interwoven, creating a narrative that was not only coherent but compelling. Observers noted that even seasoned political operatives would struggle to craft an effective rebuttal in real time against such a multi-layered presentation. The ripple effect extended beyond media coverage. Grassroots activists amplified her points, coordinating social media campaigns, town halls, and community forums that built on Crockett's messaging. Her ability to connect national attention to local action exemplified a modern approach to political influence, one that combines the viral power of media with concrete strategies for civic engagement. Analysts speculated that this could redefine the benchmarks for future campaign events, where substance and performative credibility are equally essential. By the evening, the narrative had crystallized. Crockett had shifted the conversation from a routine campaign announcement to a substantive critique of state leadership, forcing media, political opponents, and voters alike to confront overlooked failures. Cornyn's office, while experienced in managing political optics, was publicly exposed as reactive rather than proactive. Crockett's speech became a template for political accountability, demonstrating how precision, evidence, and timing can command attention, influence public discourse, and potentially alter the trajectory of political contests. As the night settled, it was clear that Crockett's Dallas address had achieved more than momentary virality. It had created a sustained conversation, mobilized constituents, and challenged entrenched narratives, reinforcing the idea that effective political leadership is inseparable from clear communication, factual rigor, and fearless accountability. Her ability to intertwine data, storytelling, and public engagement positioned her not merely as a critic of current leadership, but as a formidable force shaping the future of Texas politics. In short, Jasmine Crockett's confrontation of Senator Cornyn wasn't a fleeting political moment. It was a meticulously executed demonstration of accountability, strategy, and public resonance. Every statistic, every anecdote, and every well-timed pause reinforced a narrative of leadership scrutiny that Texans and the nation will continue to dissect, discuss, and learn from for months to come.